Welcome back, Budget Advisory Committee members. This is the second presentation in our education series for the committee. And again, this is Kristin Bell, and we're going to talk about the budget development process today. And we're just going to kind of launch right into it here. Basically, there are three focus areas of our budget development. The revenues that we talked about last time, expenditures, and change in fund balance. Under the revenues, there's three main categories that we are watchful around, are the enrollment projections, the legislative impacts, and then our local tax revenue calculations. Under expenditures, the big ticket players would be our staffing as it relates to enrollment, any programming that we're going to plan on offering, and then bargaining impacts. And then the difference between the revenues and expenditures would equate to what a change in fund balance is. And so whatever that number ends up being, we need to be mindful around remaining within our board policy. Our board policy says that we must have a minimum of 5% of our budgeted revenues in fund balance. The fund balance amount also impacts our economic health indicators that external entities will look at from a credit rating standpoint and from a financial health standpoint. And then additionally, if we predict or are projecting a change in fund balance that is more than anticipated, we would need to get board approval in order to use those additional funds. So starting over at the left, this is just our budget process, big ticket players through basically mid-December through June, July. So enrollment is projected, legislative impacts are determined, that's our revenue projection component. Then we start looking at how many teachers we need for staffing based on the projected students coming in. We look at our programming, we use the budgeting by priorities process for that programming. And as a budget advisory committee member, you will be seeing the outputs of the budgeting by priority process and be able to talk to some directors about their work and be able to look at those proposals. So more to come on that. Then we also look at our local bargained impacts. We have to identify those and apply those toward our expenditure projections. And then we look at, okay, what are our revenues, what are our expenditures, and what's the difference? And then depending on if generally those don't come out balancing to the penny out of the gate. So we do need to look at where we're at and make adjustments as necessary. And if those adjustments are too big, we would need to get board approval to use fund balance for that. And of course, the chief financial officer would consult with the superintendent and the cabinet before doing anything like that. But through this whole process, we are keeping a watchful eye on what our anticipated expenditures are and our anticipated revenue. So there shouldn't be any real surprises by the time we get to that end of that process. It's there may be small things that are here and there that we may need to adjust, but big ticket players, I've never experienced. We are taking care of that early on when we see some big issues coming up. Starting a little bit deeper into the enrollment projections themselves. So enrollment is the major component of our state funding resources. And it's based on a 10-month average of FTE. We predict in the spring how many students we think we're going to get, and here's the revenue, the state revenue associated with that. And then we kind of ride off of that from September through December of the following year, and the state funds us as if we have those enrolled kids that we projected. Then come January, the state looks back and says, okay, Tacoma, what did you actually have in September, October, November, and December from a student standpoint? And then they balance us out. So if we understated the enrollment, they would give us more funding. If we overstated the enrollment, they would give us less funding. So it is really imperative that we try and get as close to accurate as we can with that enrollment projection. We do use a demographer for helping us gather those numbers. He historically has been within 5% just a 0.05 error rate, so 99.5 accuracy rate, and which is a really fantastic number for the amount of kids we have. And it has really helped us hone in on our revenue projections and stay pretty true to reality when the students actually come in. On the left there, you can see, I've kind of condensed it for the slide view, but you can just see a high level trend of our enrollment from 2011 is on the far left, and then all the way out to 2029. So it looks like a lot there, a big swing, but if you look at the numbers, it's really only about 400 students variance between the lowest point and, well, actually more than that, it's about 500 students difference between the lowest point and the highest point. So not an enormous swing from an enrollment standpoint, but something to keep an eye on nonetheless. Okay, talking about legislative impacts. So, beginning in about mid-December, the governor will push out his projected ballot budget for the upcoming biennium, and then following that, the legislature starts in around January, and then somewhere between January and April, we receive the House budget, a Senate budget, and then ultimately the conference budget, which is what we build our budget off of. So the governor will come out and we'll look at that and we'll say, okay, here's how if his budget came to fruition, this is how it would impact our district. Or a Senate budget comes to fruition, this is how it would impact our district and House and so forth. So we aren't usually blindsided by the time the conference comes out unless nothing has been out on the table yet. But we're watching those other three budgets and looking for similarities, or and the opposite, if things are way out of whack from one another, then we know that, okay, this is going to be maybe a hot spot that we, we got to keep our eye on. So the areas in bullets here are kind of the driver rates that are determined by the legislature that do impact our expenditures substantially. And as most of you know, and I stated before, 85% of our budget roughly is represented by salaries and benefits. So as you must guess, these areas do impact salary, which then impacts a large amount of our expenditures. So that once we kind of have an idea of where we think our revenue is going to come in at, we also, it's actually in parallel to that. We look at our enrollment projections and we look at, by grade and by building where we think they're going to be. And then we project staffing for those schools, teacher staffing. And the basic ed teachers are calculated through what we call a staffing model. And we ultimately, look at the projected student FTE at a building and divide it by the class size limits that have been identified in the collective bargaining agreement with our teachers. And it kicks out a number of teachers. Then the categorical departments will come in and the program directors will provide recommendations for staffing additional teachers through the categorical lens at those buildings. And then on top of that, there are library, music, and PE teachers allocated out to the individual buildings. And the allocation methodology around that has to do with the collective bargaining agreement. Again, we look at how many classrooms a particular elementary building has, and then we identify the planning period necessary, and then we make sure that the music, PE, and library teachers cover those planning periods. Another layer of the staffing at the school level would be your building administration, your principal, your office staff, et cetera. And we use kind of a two-pronged approach to allocate administrative supports at the school buildings. One is the projected number of enrollment. How many students is that building going to have next year? And then the second one is a little bit more unique to each building. And we look at these things here. We call it a school score. And we calculate a school score by looking at, okay, how many McKinney-Vento or homeless students does this particular building have on a trend basis? And what's the trend for their free and reduced lunch students? What percent of their students are free and reduced? What percent of their students are special education? English language learners? Do they have a high mobility rate? Are kids coming and going all year long, or is it a pretty stable environment? And then how many teachers are in that building that that principal would have to evaluate ultimately? So we take all those pieces and put them together into a calculation, and it kicks out a score. And we combine that score with the enrollment, projected enrollment for that building, and then that provides a unique recipe, if you will, of administrative staff at that particular school. When we talk about identifying the programming and the allocations associated with the programming, we have a process called budgeting by priorities, and that is a ultimately this is the circle of life, we call it here on the right hand side. And I'll just walk you through it and help you explain what it is exactly. We identify the funding as usual, like we did just for the rest of the budget. We look at the priorities that, thankfully, in our district, the board has already identified those through the strategic plan and benchmarks. Those are the priorities that everyone is trying to get to and trying to achieve. Then we do a call for proposals. And what that is anyone in our district, now mind you, schools and principals are excluded from this process. Superintendent did not want them participating in this because they have the staffing model, and this is more of a program based process. So anyway, we call for proposals, and then the person or the individual who has budget oversight writes a proposal, and they talk about what the issue is with, like, the natural issue of the work. Why are they there? Why is it important? What are they trying to solve? Who are their stakeholders? What are their goals? What are their measurements? How do we know they're doing a good job? And then they'll put all this in a narrative and then say, okay, in order to do this work district, I need these resources. And then that proposal ultimately is accepted at the bottom at 6 o'clock there on the circle of life. And then they go up to the superintendent and her cabinet. And I have rank proposals there, but review proposals is probably a better term. They go through all of those proposals and requests and accept, deny, or edit based on the situation and the data associated with those proposals. And then ultimately, they are finalized and communicated out. And the communication, again, is in the center of this circle of life. So it does happen. It's an internal process in our district. So the communication does go through regularly. On the left there, I won't go through each and every one of those bullets, but those are kind of the benefits of um, running through budgeting by priorities and doing this process rather than your standard approach. This slide talks about the difference between the traditional approach and our budgeting by priorities approach. Traditional approach is usually you'd start with a base budget or your current year budget, you increase it or decrease it, tweak it a little bit, and then you roll it forward just as is. The biggest distinction with budgeting by priorities is that there's not a real base to start with. It's more that, each we dive deeper into each proposal and identify the work, and then the department or program that is doing that work or using those resources needs to basically prove that they're doing a good job and they're moving the mark, and that their strategy for pushing out the work is working. So it's not that many times we'll talk about categorical. You're going to get the categorical dollars no matter what. That is a true statement. However, is the approach to and strategy that we're using those categorical dollars maximizing student benefit? Yes or no? And do you have data to show that? And so that's kind of, it's a deeper understanding and representation of the dollars that are associated with the work. So just wanted to kind of run that by you and give you a heads up on that. Again, we talk about our local bargaining impacts. We have 11 bargaining groups in our district, and each one of those bargaining groups has their own collective bargaining agreement and unique agreements. Increases in salaries based on whatever year. Professional development time. So, teachers, for example, have optional days. Sometimes some of them have uniform. benefits. There's all sorts of things that are embedded in those 11 collective bargaining agreements that may impact the up and coming budget year. So once we get to the end of all that, then we look at our revenues. And here's the areas that we look at: the legislative impacts. Underneath that, we're looking at the rates per student that we're anticipating, um, how many how many instructional staffing units that the state is going to give us, and then how much they're going to give us for each one of those units. We will talk about staffing units more in an up and coming presentation. So that's just kind of a little bit more complicated topic, but again, we'll talk more about that in the future. The medical and retirement benefit rates are impactful, and then per student material, supplies, and operating costs. So those are pretty big ticket players under the legislative impacts. Again, levy calculations. Those of you that listened to the presentation, the first presentation, I had mentioned that, a few years back, the local levy or the enrichment dollars would have been green in nature rather than yellow. Well, this is that law that changed, that caused them to be yellow, essentially. So really the levy calculations must be enrichment in nature, and that is getting that right and spending those appropriately is an area that we need to pay close attention to. Then we try and we project the local receipts that we talked about in the last session. Also, we look at all of our grant opportunities, federal, state, and private. How much do we anticipate getting in? Where are the costs going? Indirect rates. Indirect rates are basically an acknowledgement of a grant that there's more to providing a service than the direct service itself. For example, somebody has to pay for the lights to be on, and somebody has to pay for the chair that the student sits in, and and so forth. And so those are uh, most grants allow for an indirect rate or a small chunk to kind of slides off the top to cover lighting and heating and just your overhead of having a program. And then lastly, but certainly not least, are the number of projected students that would impact our state revenue. Then we're looking at the final items for the expenditures. We're looking at how many final classroom basic ed teachers do we need for the future year? What kind of support staff? What kind of operational staff do we need? What kind of food service and custodial? And are there changes in that? Do we have brand new buildings that we didn't have in the past that would need a custodian crew that we've never had, or things like that? Again, we look at legislative impacts, the local bargain agreements, actual cost of salary and benefits, the grant amounts as mentioned, any unfunded mandates we might have where we're required to provide a service based on RCW or WAC, but there isn't necessarily there either is A, zero funding for it, or B, not enough funding for it. Those would be those unfunded mandates. And then we have many great community partnerships that we have agreements with where we may have a commitment to them, and in lieu of them having a commitment to us. I mean, back and forth, it just depends on the agreement and the services that we are in partnership with on those community groups. And then lastly, we look at the total amount of projected revenues against the total amount of projected expenditures, and hopefully, perfect world, there's zero. Revenues, expenditures would be zero. That does not happen in reality very often, or it's never happened to the penny, right? So we look at that differentiation there, and depending on what it is, we would see a change in fund balance. Now, we wouldn't see big amounts at the end of this and be like, oh, surprise, there's some kind of $1 million, you know, um, out of alignment there, because we're watching and calculating all the way through. And so we're pretty aware of things that are going to push us up over that revenue threshold, or if we're staying under that revenue threshold. So when we get to that last part, it's usually just tweaking small items here and there, and or making some small changes and adjustments. Okay, that is the last slide I have for you today. I would like to thank you again for listening and participating in the Budget Advisory Committee. If you have questions or concerns, again, about any of this information, I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. And you can email. I don't have the visual aid for the contact information this time, but I'll tell it to you verbally, and then it will also be on the budget website. My budget contact is budget at Tacoma dot K12 dot WA dot US. And that is my email contact. If you would like to answer questions or have some follow-up conversations, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. Okay, well, thank you for listening again, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.